Thank you for hanging out with us here today at C3 Converse, presented by Nielsen. We just had a powerful conversation with Eunice and Yusuf. Thank you, Jeremy, for hosting. And now we present the next artist conversation of another powerful documentary, Down a Dark Stairwell. This is the Kai Gurley and NYPD officer Peter Liang, but it's also George Floyd and Officer Tu Tao. And you can also feel Latasha Harlins and Sun Jadu, right? Kai Gurley was killed walking down a set of stairs. Breonna Taylor was killed while sleeping. How do we clearly say it? That Black lives matter. And to our Asian American communities, we need to do the work to be better allies. Racism and anti-Blackness exist in our communities, and we urge you to be anti-racist and to create stories that combat racism, colorism, and anti-Blackness. Folks, please welcome our host, festival programmer, Linda Liang.
Welcome everyone to the first weekend. Let me adjust my lighting here. And first weekend of the LA Asian Pacific Film Festival, presented by Visual Communication, and our C3 Converse Artist Conversation. My name again is Lindy Liang. I'm the senior programmer at the festival, and I'm zooming in from my home in Silver Lake, Los Angeles, California, on the native lands of the Chumash and Tolva peoples. I wanted to tell folks today that if you would like to read the closed caption, we're dropping a link in the chat now, and you can click on that, and it will bring a new window that will open up with the audio transcript. I also want to thank everyone for making the festival possible, especially our VC members and our sponsors, community organization partners. You can see a list of those folks at our festival website at festival.vc.org. And I just want to get this artist conversation rolling and welcome the team from Down a Dark Stairwell, Director Ursula Liang and Editor Michelle Chang. Hi Ursula. Hi, Michelle. It's good to meet you. I just wanted to ask, first of all, to thank you for joining us this afternoon, and just to see how you guys, checking in to see how you guys are doing there in New York right now, what's going on with COVID, and obviously with BLM and what we're going to be talking about, which is the central subject of your documentary today.
Thank you so much for having us here. We have a very special place in our heart for LA Asian. We premiered my first film that Michelle and I both worked on with you guys for our West Coast premiere a couple of years ago. And thank you also for asking how I'm doing. It feels like there's just so much going on. I'm joining you from the Bronx, New York, which is Lenape land, and it's sort of the epicenter of things when the pandemic started, and continues to be a place where police sirens run up and down my street every day, and I'm also having like drilling on the outside of my building. So this whole pandemic thing and all that's going on in the world is quite a lot. But I'm happy to be here, and I'm really excited to be part of this community as we're sort of coming together to celebrate the festival and be inspired by all the films here.
Wonderful. How are you, Michelle? It's lovely to meet you. I've heard so much about you from Ursula.
Hi. Thanks, and thanks for welcoming me into this panel. I'm Zooming from my apartment in Brooklyn, New York. And I mean, things are obviously calmer here than they were back in the spring when it was crazy time. But it's still, it's an ongoing thing, obviously, with COVID. And I have a kid, so it's all about the school mess now and remote learning and trying to survive all of that. So, but, we're well and healthy, so happy to be here.
Wonderful. I'm so happy to hear that. I just wanted to, we have so much to cover, and we'll try to get as much as we can in today, but I wanted to go over a few things about the production of the documentary and a little bit about the art and craft, and obviously its use as a tool of activism moving forward. So I'm going to try to toss some questions at you about that, and we'll answer that accordingly. I just wanted to also thank Ursula for joining us again. She was last with us at the 2014 festival where she presented Nine Men, and that won the Festival Audience Award here, and I think we won the Director Award for the Special Jury Award for Best Director. So this particular, we're glad to have you back with this project. And it goes without belaboring the point, or even that it is not only topical, but it comes at a flashpoint, a cultural and racial reckoning in the U.S. that was ignited just most recently on May 25th by the tragic and preventable death of George Floyd in Minneapolis at the hand of local police, and then the ensuing Black Lives Matter protests nationwide. And just this past evening, as I was preparing to speak with you both today, I was looking at the footage of protests in anger over the wrongful death of Breonna Taylor, and who was killed on just March 13th of this year, and the lack of accountability by the Louisville police. So this is the context I just wanted to set for folks. Unless you've been hiding under a rock, you know about this, what has occurred in just the last 6 months. And obviously with the presidential election looming before us, and our president's kind of ineffectualness, incapacity to deal with this reckoning, like I want to ask right off with a very kind of pregnant question, a very big question, like this: how does the story of a young African-American man, Akai Gurley, and his wrongful death at the hands of a rookie Asian-American NYPD cop, Peter Liang, like fit into this kind of larger cultural dialogue about race and law enforcement? I mean, that's a big question, so we can unpack that. Oh, Ursula, you have to unmute.
Sorry, the sirens keep coming by my street, so I am
no worries.
Alternately when they come by, but you are definitely coming off the top with a very big question. I have to remind everybody that I am a filmmaker, and there's a reason why I choose, film as a medium, and it takes us 5 years to make a film, because we're sort of like, parsing over every little detail and nuance of the film in order to be able to say something without bumbling it out in a live conversation where we're on the spot. So forgive me if I'm not, if I can't really answer some of these questions. When we were making the film, it was relevant when we started, and I don't think that we thought that it would continue. I guess you don't hope that it continues to have the same kind of relevance over and over and over and over again in a very specific way. I mean, there were a lot of things that happened in the world in the process of making the film that made us think, oh, it would be great if the film were done right now. This is something that really could speak to this moment. For instance, like when Charlottesville happened, and you had this sort of like very visible rise of white supremacy, we were like, I think our film fits into this space too. That moment passed. I think it's still relevant, but right when we were releasing the film, it came out in March at True False. We were experiencing something very different, and something that felt very close at the same time. So, I don't totally know how to answer your question, other than to say that there's just so much going on right now. It's a film that's not necessarily an easy watch. We hope that it's a film that brings audiences. Brings them to a different level of understanding of what's going on. But I feel like there are pieces of the film that can relate to almost all these things that are happening in the world. And I hope that means that it will have some longevity and will really spark different ideas in different people who watch it. But I think that's a really tough question to answer. And so I will hand over to Michelle. She's always like good at filling in the blanks where I can't fill them in.
Michelle, would you like to try to tackle that question? And there's no need to answer like just some, what you had on the top of your head about what I just asked, and we can continue with.
I think obviously when the incident itself happened, which was in 2014, it was right in the middle of Eric Garner and Michael Brown and Tamir Rice and Freddie Gray and all these things, and it was so fit right in the umbrella of those cases at that time, which is part of why it became such a big deal at that time. And then by the time we were making the film, which was, I can't even remember, like 2017 or something maybe. And by that time, it's been a few years, and it was almost like that peak had passed, and it was almost like there was a fatigue about these issues, at the time. And then, by the time the film rolls out, here we are again, and suddenly like, at the top of everyone's mind again, and in a much bigger way than it was in 2014. And so it's got a new, relevance, and fits right in all these issues. At the same time, it's always been a unique case, that's a little, set apart from all these other police brutality cases, just because of all the specific details of the case, and also because, and why we made the film, wasn't really to make a film about police brutality, but about why this particular case elicited, these really interesting reactions from two different communities of colors experiencing the same case. So in that way, it's always kind of got its own unique thing going on.
Well, thank you very much for highlighting the background of the project, which kind of leads me into more of a more mundane kind of question about the production itself. Kai Gurley was killed on November 20th, 2014, and then your documentary follows the trial, indictment, and sentencing of Peter Liang till about April of 2016. Was it, when were you able to like decide on this as your next like documentary project, and if so, what was the impetus for the project? Were you following the case from the very beginning, or it was something that you felt like compelled to do from an activist perspective?
I mean, I definitely was following the case from the beginning. It was something that, came across my desk in form of news flashes. And as soon as I saw the name, I knew that this would add a complication to the story and the movement, the fact that this police officer was Asian American. And I think a lot of us in our community, when things, when bad things happen, you never wanted to be somebody from your community. And I think I had that same feeling when I read the news. It's like, oh no. It also happened to be a person with my same last name and the same first name as my brother. So I was really keyed in on the case. But I'm a self-taught filmmaker, I'm a self-taught journalist, and the world of the justice system is very confusing. Like, that incident happened in 2014, but the case wasn't really actually moved forward until 2016. So it was very hard for me as I was finishing up another film to like keep track of everything that was going on. So I kind of lost sight of the case until I got an email or a Facebook message from an old source of mine, and he sent me a document that was basically an 18-page Google document written in Chinese and English, and it outlined a protest that was happening the next day. And I had never seen anything like so organized and so laid out and so motivated in the activist space in the Asian American community. And I've been around it for a long time, and so I was just curious, and I took my camera, I took the subway, and I got off the train station in Brooklyn, and I turned one corner, I didn't see anything, turned another corner, and I saw this sea of thousands and thousands of people. And sort of at that very moment, I knew that this was very significant to the Asian American community. That would be a very significant pinpoint on our Asian American history timeline. And I also knew that, regular journalists who were following the story wouldn't quite understand that. They would see it as another protest, people in the streets, people rallying. It's something that you see on the news quite a lot, but I don't think that people really understand how the scale of that was unusual for our community, and how the scale of that would be problematic for our relationship in this like coalition of people of color. So it did, in some part it felt like a responsibility historically to tell the story, and also felt like a responsibility, not as an activist or organizer, but a person who cares about these communities, and kind of knew what the scale of this event, the effect of that would be, or anticipated it. So I sort of, at that moment, which was, far in the timeline of the film and far in the timeline of the story, that's when we really started filming. And, Michelle's job, and one of the toughest jobs she had, was trying to build back a sort of in the moment narrative, which didn't include footage that we had shot. So, a lot of what it was piecing together citizen journalist work, third-party materials, and trying to find a way to tell the story with our original footage, the stuff that actually has all the proper cutaways and stuff, really coming at the very late end of the story.
Brilliant. That leads me to another question about securing, was also asked by my other programmer colleagues about making documentaries. In this case, you're working with the Asian and Black communities. and securing permissions for shooting with them, and especially with Kai's family members, like his aunt and I think his mother at some point, his partner. Just like, how were you able as an Asian American filmmaker to secure that, that to gain that intimate access, like to secure that level of trust with the key players and the African American community? Was there a particular strategy that you enacted in order to help with that, and also additionally with the Chinese American side, how cooperative were they, and when you proposed this film and wanting to show Peter's side of the story?
Well, you and I have the same last name in characters, and so it was very clear to me in the beginning that my last name might be a point of confusion for people who are not familiar with Chinese culture and how popular our name is, and that people might think I was actually related to Peter. So I made an early choice to approach Akai's family in the streets, like not by email or any sort of distant approach. And so I actually, the first time I met them was sort of a publicly announced protest that I went to with a friend of mine who happened to be Black. And Akai's family, Akai's aunt was very welcoming right away. I think they understood the power of the media, and like the first day we met her, we filmed them sort of a little bit from the side as protesters, and then we asked them, whether we could put a mic on her, and she allowed us to put a mic on her and follow her through the pink houses on that day. So I give them a lot of credit, because their willingness to be open to media is I think really effective as part of the organizing strategy, and when I know it comes with a lot of risks. So over time it's taken a lot of relationship building and a lot of back and forth, and people who are going through trauma have different feelings at different times. And so there are times when they felt more open to us and times they felt less open to us. As far as the Asian American community, I think the strategy for me always is to have an introduction. I think that introductions are very important in the Asian community. And so I did have an introduction to some of those characters, and I always kind of tried to play it that way. But there was also, I think there's a different relationship to media in the Asian community, and folks are not as comfortable with sharing a very open and unfettered access. So I thought it was actually more difficult to find an Asian American, to find a space there. But I also had spent 7 years in the community making 9 Man. So there were people I knew, and having relationships already in that community helps a lot. I wish I had language facility. That would have helped me a lot, but sometimes you just need to do what you can do with what you have.
And then I just want to also bring Michelle into the conversation about this. Before I ask a little bit about the editing process, I feel after watching this film several times now, and I feel like any of you watching this just from a first watch, I feel like you strike that precarious balance of showing both sides of the story and what happened on that fateful day down that stairwell at the pink houses. So according to who were there, the first responders, the various community members, government officials involved, and even some of the public responses. So how important was that for you to kind of achieve that? Do you think you have achieved that with what you were able to capture? Like the footage you were able, and the access you were able to gain, to try to tell a balanced story as much as possible from your perspective as a documentary filmmaker? It's a big question of it.
Is that a question for me?
Yeah, Michelle, you can jump in and add, about the balancing of the story, just the amount of footage from the African American community and the Chinese American community story, and trying to be as unbiased as possible to present the case, the footage you were able to capture about the different two stories going on, the different truths that are being presented, not only in the media, but also that's being presented by both sides, and how your film works to try to strike that balance. And you can answer in however you like.
I think, balance was always a concern throughout the editing process, and a big concern for Ursula. And always thinking about how it's going to be received, you know, after it's done by these communities, and while you're sort of gaining trust with them. And obviously, as an editor, I'm not the one like out there gaining trust with the community, but, you know, just to keep that in mind about how we're presenting things and not knowing how they're going to feel about, you know, that we're also kind of in with the other side and whatever. And it's also, it wasn't like just two sides. There's this third, you know, kind of contingency with the CAV group too, which was in a way, it was not as main, you know, a thread. It ended up being more of a sub-thread. But we're always concerned about that balance. And, you know, in some ways, as she was saying before, we were just sort of limited by, you know, the footage we had about, you know, stuff that we had to cover prior to, you know, when a lot of the filming that she did began in earnest, which was really like after the trial. So all this stuff before and sort of getting to know the communities and introducing them, you know, we had to rely on, you know, interviews that were shot later and sort of introducing characters that way. And then also this kind of third party footage. There's also, you know, we want to balance, but at the same time, it felt like the, you know, the activism coming out of the Chinese American community in this case was the more novel thing in terms of, you know, what we're presenting in a film and what, you know, people had already at that point seen a lot of like Black Lives Matter, you know, activism, but they had not really seen this level of Asian American activism. So that in a way, I think it wasn't more important to present, but it was going to be kind of the more novel thing in the film. So, and then the big giant protest that happens is like kind of the big, you know, one of the big peaks of the film. So in a way, we were always going to give more weight to like that protest because it was such an enormous, you know, giant thing, you know, compared to any of the like the Acai protests, for instance. But in the end, you know, I think we always tried to, you know, really be in the shoes of like both communities and really understand like what's going on all sides and not feel like the film is firmly on either side. So hopefully, I think we did achieve that balance, and we, you know, are kind of empathetic with both sides and critical of both sides, you know, at the same time. So hopefully we got it as best we could, but it was always, you know, something to worry about.
No, thank you for that response, because that leads right into my next question to tease out some points in the film. You mentioned the Chinese American community being a lot more. I think I phrased it in my notes here about this particular case rocked them out of a certain complacency about the state of our society when it comes to race, and it forced them to kind of deal with kind of the rampant anti-Blackness that's in Asian communities that have been suppressed. It also, and I put this in my notes saying that the whole legal courtroom proceedings and the press coverage, it illuminated and made visible the Chinese American community and the imprint of the cultural, social, political power of various Asian communities in New York's history. So it's like in the guise of this baby-faced rookie cop, Peter Liang, who's the son of Hong Kong immigrants. So I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit about how these delicate fault lines, how were you able to navigate these delicate fault lines with the Chinese community, who was probably more camera shy about talking about race relation, their place in American society as an invisible minority, as they felt. In this case, kind of brings them front and center in a potentially very uncomfortable situation. And I feel like your film navigates that very well, but I wonder about the behind the scenes, about how that footage got captured, and yeah, just some of the politics of that within the Chinese American community.
I mean, I find that once you start talking to people, that they don't have a problem being honest and really talking about what's on their minds. I do feel like the community was trying to express something through this whole protest, which is that, there's sort of like never a time for us to say something. There are a lot of issues that people can acknowledge are happening to the Asian American community, where the community really needs some more support and is feeling a lot of injustice, but it's almost always like the timing is not right for those conversations to surface. So I think that in part is part of the frustration of the community. There's, and also I think a lot of the subjects would not say that they were talking about race. While I think, me, I'm sort of race obsessed. I'm a person of race, mixed race heritage, and it's a topic that I'm very interested in. I would say both sides really wanted to make the point that they were thinking about like very specific ideas of justice. And while race was a component of it, and on the surface, when they have different points of view, it looks very specific to those of us on the outside, seeing, Asian people here and Black people here, at each other's faces in the streets. But, if you were talking to the Kai Gurley supporters, they were not thinking about Peter as a Chinese American man. They were thinking about him as a police officer. They saw the badge, they saw the blue before they saw anything else. And that is such a traumatic identity. If you're coming from the Black experience, that is what you see before anything else. And similarly, I think that, the Asian American community always wanted to make the point that it wasn't, that they felt that this was just an unfair situation. I think their identification with the cause often had to do with the fact that Peter did look like them and looked like their sons and daughters, and that there felt like there was some sort of familiar in culture kind of connection to him. But they would always say that it was about the issues. That said, all those people could say it had nothing to do with race, and it has everything to do with race at the same time. And that's an element of the story that does interest me and a lot of other folks.
No, that's very illuminating. I just wanted to, this film definitely, as folks will come to see, that it really spotlights how communities of color, in this case Asian and Black, have been historically pitted against each other under white supremacy. And so your documentary, I feel like, expands this very important dialogue about community building that has to happen within BIPOC communities in order to protect mutual interests in advocating for a less racist and more humane society in the future. So that being said, I was very struck by this coda in your film of two young Black men on the street corner. This comes very late in the film, where you have on-camera testimonials where they're basically eloquently and very kind of earnestly talking about how they felt when Peter Liang was singled out potentially for punishment in this wrongful death because he was a minority cop. So the gentleman adamantly said that, and then there was that exchange where there was also this affirmation that they didn't think that all cops were bad. They were just rotten apples in any institutions. And so I thought that exchange was very powerful, and it kind of like solidified to me how you want this documentary to function as an activist tool to kind of bring these communities together and have this kind of like peaceful and kind of but hard-hitting yet honest dialogue. So I'm just kind of, I don't know, I just wanted to bring that particular scene to illustrate.
I'm glad that you like that scene, because it many times was on the cutting room floor, because it happens so late in the film and so afterwards, and it's not connected to sort of the characters in the story. But we really like the idea of elevating sort of these street level conversations. There'd been so much press about this that really like stuck cameras and mics in the faces of spokespeople and activists who are very like on message and don't get into as much nuance. And I should be clear that Michelle was not my only creative collaborator. We had definitely Black folks in the edit that were talking from the start that had ideas of things that they wanted, and they wanted specifically to have a diversity of Black thought in the film, because just like the Asian American community, this is not a monolithic community. There were a lot of different opinions bubbling in the community. So the genesis of that little scene is actually kind of a favorite for me, because I was standing on the street with the DP just taking like B-roll of the neighborhood that Akai lived in, and some folks were watching us, and they had a pizza on their car, and they were just eating their pizza like outside on the street. And as I stepped back and my DP was shooting, they just started talking to me, asking what we were doing. And they were just saying such interesting things. And they also, I think the first thing they did was actually offer me a piece of pizza, which I was very tempted to take because I was hungry. But, you know, like, I thought it was such a precious experience because the fact that we were sort of like open and having this conversation on the street, these are two men that I think a lot of Asian Americans would walk by and judge in a very specific way. But in the space that we met, they were offering me food and they were offering me conversation, and they had all these brilliant things to say. So they were on their way to a baby shower, but they, like, you know, they decided they could go a little bit late and have this conversation on the street corner for us. And I just sort of love them as personalities. So I'm glad that the little scene is resonating with people in the film. But Michelle, I gotta say, like, that was a very tough conversation for her to cut because they talk in this like really animated and intertwined way. I don't know how you cut it because they're just like talking on top of each other in this really charming way.
Well, there was also the fact that, you know, just completely unplanned, the police did happen to drive by them like 50 times and like walk by just to totally illustrate, you know, the point that they were talking about. So, you know, you can't orchestrate that kind of thing. But, you know, I think another, as you say, like in that conversation, they kind of, one of them has some sympathy, you know, for the cops. And I think there's something key in these small moments where, you know, one, like people do have empathy for the other side, and those moments are kind of few and far between. Like I think for most of the time, like what happens in the film is that you have these two communities and they're just like in their separate, you know, corners, like doing their thing. And even though, as Ursula talked about, they're both talking about using the same words, like talking about justice, but meaning like two completely, you know, different things. And, you know, the reality is that the communities do have like very different interests and language and culture. And then there's just like a few points where the groups actually come together in the film. And like, one is that, you know, at that big protest, there's a counter protest and they're there. And mostly it's just a lot of like cross shouting, and that's like, you know, completely not counterproductive. But then there is this like conversation between two people, you know, a Chinese guy and a Black woman from the community, and they try to have a little, you know, dialogue. And that's one of, you know, like a great moment in the film where they're really trying to just actually like talk about it, aside from all the shouting. And then, you know, there's another time like at the, there's like a juror misconduct hearing, and, you know, they come together again and it's a lot of shouting, or like it's sentencing and so most of the time they're not really like coming together. And so anytime there's these like small moments where you can actually like the community can get out of your vacuum and just kind of like really try to put yourself in the shoes of the other side, I think are, you know, what's going to be key to like any possibility of like finding common ground, you know, for solidarity.
I think your film, achieves that in my mind. And I mean, not only that particular scenes resonated with me, but also, and you brought this up earlier, Ursula, about one of the nonprofits that was highlighted, Kathy Dang, who's the executive director at, is it Kava? I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the anti-Asian violence organization in New York City. She was interviewed as being, so she was an avid supporter of BLM, but she's also the figurehead of an Asian American community activist. And she mentioned getting death threats at one point because she was supporting BLM while also representing kind of like the Chinese side. So I thought that was also important to include, to show that, you know, especially her as speaking from a younger generation, and to have to kind of seed that intergenerational dialogue about race and how that around this particular case, how a lot of younger generation activists like her don't see a conflict in supporting BLM and also advocating for racial justice within the API community. So I just wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about that as well. Yeah. Maybe more footage, or how you.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because this all also, remember, happened at a time when there was a lot of interest in racial division and interference from like Russia and China online. So I really appreciated that she talked about sort of the traumatic experience of being sort of jumped on by the Asian American community in ways that, that with a little bit of time, she was like, maybe it was all in my head and maybe this wasn't real, but in the moment it was very real, and she felt very threatened. And, no one in America should feel threatened for their point of view. And my heart really went out to her. It's her organization is, a progressively led organization in America. And a lot of folks really have a problem with us framing the film or even saying that this was sort of like the first time Asian people like came out in any number, because there have people who've been organizing the Asian American community for generations and generations and generations. And they've had real solidarity and real alliances with the Black community and other communities of color. Some flashes of those we see in the, in moments in like sort of artistic treatments in the film. But, the organization works on things like affordable housing and anti-violence. She specifically talks about police killings of Asian American citizens. And that was important for us to underline in the film, because people do not see Asians as victims of anything other than, eye pulling and funny name calling. But there is actual violence against the community. There's police violence against the community. There's several instances of it underlined in the film from her and also from people who are even supporting Peter. So those are, and there are definitely places where, the organization she works with have very like specific points of solidarity where it's really important to be working with other communities of color. And I think, our community as Asian Americans is very diverse, and we have very different identities. And as you mentioned before, the film is sort of like, if you know Asian American studies, you sort of know what we're showing you. We're showing you the old Chinatown heads, the 5th generation people who've been here. We're showing you the young woke folks. We're showing you like the new immigrants, the after 65 people. And those people all come from very different places. And but we still have a legacy of sort of self-isolation. The community still does not feel protected enough to be, to not be self-isolated in some ways. And so, part of what interests me in the film is like conversations about what that means when we have sort of cultural isolation, and when we have cultural nationalism, and where we see only the pain of the people that look like us. Like, what does that mean? And how good a strategy is that moving forward? Is thinking sort of in this microcosmic way, is that the best strategy for gaining justice and equality for our communities? Or is this reaching across the aisle an important component of how we move forward?
No, yeah, I think that really did strike me throughout the film. And I'm just wondering now, this project and coming at this particular time in our country, and the intensity of the dialogue about racial injustice and basically communities of color being kind of put in the forefront. And this film definitely speaks to that dialogue, that it was there but hasn't been center, and now it's pushing that to the center about the BIPOC community solidarity. I'm just curious to know, in the shadow of continued police brutality against African American, especially African American men, and not to forget Breonna Taylor, who's at the forefront of our mind. How do you see this film now moving forward, as you're playing not only the Human Rights Watch Festival that I saw the film in, also Black Star, and then now you're starting your run here with us as part of the Asian Pacific Islander Festival circuit. How do you see this film, circulating, and maybe the reaction of different audience demographics to what you're presenting here? And was there a strategy or a thought into putting your film there?
It's very hard in this moment because we're not getting a lot of audience reactions. So if there are folks on here right now that are watching the film and have thoughts, good or bad, please tweet them or send them to us, because we're not, it's a little bit of an echo chamber not having in-person screenings. So, I was in particular excited to be playing at Black Star because it is a conversation that I think is not, while, you know, I'm a member of the Asian American community and I want to always ask hard questions of my own community and have us question our own behavior in this world, I think that I don't think it's a film. I'm not hoping that the film is specifically targeting only us. So, I mean, the strategy with the festivals was that, you know, in some ways we definitely had our eye focused on places where there have been instances of police brutality. So we are playing in, I don't know if I could say it, but, you know, we're playing in places like Milwaukee and you know, we opened in True False, which is, you know, in the shadow of Ferguson. So, you know, I think it's, the film sometimes feels like a quiet film in relationship to these more, the explosion of stuff that's happening right now. So there are parts of me that wonder, you know, does it still have a role, or is this an old story now? But it also feels like every time we play the film that this is an access point for Asian people that they don't have otherwise. I mean, the fact that we're isolated in our own communities and we really listen and see our own community members more clearly makes this film an important part of the discussion going forward. And, you know, also, you know, it was very clear to us very early on that we were trying to pitch the film. We were trying to come up with sort of comps, and there are very few films that deal with race that are not like in reference to whiteness. So the fact that we can have a film that sort of has two communities of color in self-contained, and we don't have any white voices in the film, and intentionally so, is an important thing. And it makes it interesting to screen it for white audiences because there is something very precious. And I feel like we had this with Nine Man too. Nine Man is like this other culturally isolated community. It's a sports community, but when non-Asian audiences watched it, they felt like they were getting a window into something that they weren't able to see, because when they're in the room, their presence changes things. And so some of those community conversations that Michelle was talking about, where you've got, you know, Asian Americans sitting around a table eating food, you've got two young Black men or four young Black men standing on the street talking to each other. Those are sort of precious fly on the wall moments that I think are important for outsiders to see. And, you know, I think being part of the community, we're very lucky. We get to see that, like, you know, round circle of food all the time, and we get to be part of those conversations. But it's very, it's very unusual for people on the outside to be witness to that. So I'm proud that the film has the ability to show people that slice too.
Yeah, no, I mean, speaking of, I was very struck and very much enjoyed the footage of when like the Brooklyn Chinese community leadership was hanging out and having dim sum, and like they were basically meeting in that very, I think it's very central cultural space that Chinese folks meet up at dim sum, and they're basically organizing on how to like advocate for Peter Liang's case. So that kind of brought it home for me, you know, as a Chinese American. Like, this is something I don't see in a lot of documentary, you know, especially that has to do with activism around race, that representation and kind of that proactiveness of that community that, yeah, historically have kind of like been under the radar in terms of their activism. The activism has always existed, except it's just never been, I think, activated by this and presented in the media as such. So that's why I really value this documentary so much as, you know, a spectator, Asian American, a film professional, and a cultural worker, all those things. I think I can't, you know, while watching this film, and I wanted to bring Michelle back into this quickly. I was also struck by its kind of coming on the heels of another film from 2018, Crime and Punishment, which was made by Stephen Mang, who I noticed crewed for you on this project. So I just want to, so that film, for those people who haven't seen it, it's on, I think, Hulu now. It's about whistleblower cops who are, they're mainly Black and Latinx cops who basically spoke out about NYPD as an institution, as a racist institution that in some way coerced and pressured them to basically enforce quotas, and those quotas, crime quotas, being very much focused on minority youth. So I just wonder the influence of that film in dialogue with your film, and if any, and just kind of the depiction of systemic institutional racism in that film, and obviously with a very I had a central focus there, and then you have a central focus, but in dialogue, I mean, just some thoughts about that, anything that comes to mind on the story or the editing, on style, presentation.
That was for you, Michelle.
And again, I apologize for my dark background. It's just the office.
Right.
So,
I know you look like a shadow.
yeah, no, it's just my office is the brightest room in the house, and today is a very sunny day in Southern California, so apologies.
I don't know. I mean, you know, Crime and Punishment is a great film. I don't know that it had direct influence on me. You know, Ursula can speak to the influence that Steven literally had on the film, on our film. One thing I did want to mention, though, and it kind of goes back to your previous question about how this, like, what kind of context this film can be seen in now, and it kind of deals with, like, you know, presenting systemic racism, which is that another topic it kind of fits into that actually isn't about police brutality at all, is like education, and it's something that, like, the Chinese American community that was really out for Peter Liang, it's an area that they started protesting in, you know, sort of at the same time, like about, you know, quotas at Harvard, or something that's like a New York specific issue, but kind of like getting rid of, you know, specialized testing for high schools. You know, the mayor wants to get rid of specialized testing and make it more equitable, taking from all schools. And, you know, Chinese American community works super hard to, like, you know, get tutoring to take these tests and get it to these schools, so they, like, are really against that. And so it's another instance where these communities end up getting pitted against each other under, you know, a system that's really, it's like this greater, you know, problem of systemic racism in, you know, the education system, that's, you know, where there's a lot of inequity and issues of racial injustice. So, you know, that's another actually area that I think this film kind of teaches a lot of lessons, you know, even though it doesn't seem like it at first. And I always actually wanted to include a little bit of that in this film, but, you know, in the end it didn't really belong. But it's sort of a natural, like, place where, you know, it's another place where this film could have dialogue.
Yeah, as far as inspiration for the film, we were actually looking at a couple other films, like Call Her Ganda and The Feeling of Being Watched, which are two great films if you haven't seen them. One is about the transgender killing in the Philippines by the Marine, and the other is about a community that was being watched by the FBI or CIA or whatever, whoever watches them, a Muslim community. And part of what we were inspired by was the sort of the on the ground storytelling that always had, like, a thread of systemic stuff hanging above it, and how those films sort of kind of quietly pieced the greater systemic problems together as the film progressed. And so those were films that really inspired us. And Steven is an amazing human being. And I just look at Crime and Punishment. You know, I shot some of this film when we didn't have enough money, and Steven shoots his films, and he's a brilliant, like, cinematographer. And I just look at his film and I'm like, there's this, like, beam of light, like, so, you know, like a 1 minute scene, and there's this, like, beautiful beam of light going across the screen. And so in some ways he's always, like, an inspiration for me, but more like, we don't have that beam of light, so we need to make a film that says something that can compensate for us not having those beams of light and beautiful cinematography. He actually came in and is sort of like a Tasmanian devil of a person, and did a lot of, like, really, like, big scratching and cutting to, like, give us some new ideas. So his, you know, he had a very short time on the project, but sort of threw some of the edit into like disarray, so that we knew what was really important to us. Like, you know, after Michelle and I came back to look at some of the work he had done, some of it was really smart, and some of it really reaffirmed what we wanted to make sure was in the film. And so yeah, anyway, some great films out there that we were inspired by, and all of them contributed in some ways to us plotting the film along in the edit.
Well, thank you for the insight about Araganda and The Feeling of Being Watched, both films that have played at the various AAPI Film Festival in the last couple years. So if you guys haven't seen that, please go check it out. We're going to wrap up soon, so I wanted to ask a kind of leading out question. And so this film is I mean, I see it as a very activist-driven documentary at its heart. Like, I wonder how, even right now, like, I know we're not able to have in-person screenings, and we're just like in virtual spaces, but and I'm glad we're able to connect here on C3 Converse today. Just like the responses of African American and the Asian American communities in New York. I don't know if you've gotten any kind of feedback from folks yet, and specifically also from Akai and Peter's families and supporters. And have they watched the film, and what were their respective reactions?
Yeah, COVID has interfered with a lot of that. So where we had plans to show people, do screenings in person, we were only able to do a screening in person with Akai's aunt, and then other folks have had to watch by screener. There are some family members that are not ready to watch the film, and I think having like a theater and a date for people to come to stuff would change sort of the motivation. But it's also so much has changed, so much is like re-traumatizing in the moment that I think we just got to give people space to watch. When you were talking about the scene about the two men in the white tank tops that are having this conversation about the police, and that gives some sort of, a few sentences like give a nod to good cops. I remember Akai's aunt was like, "Who are these people, and how, and why are they talking?" Her opinion was like, I've had lunch with her, and we would be sitting somewhere, and police officer will come into this restaurant. And she was like, they shouldn't even serve them. I mean, it's her feeling about the cops, and having lived through this traumatic experience is so extreme that it's hard for her to watch people have a nuanced conversation about them, or to even be in their presence. And I think that most people would understand that. Yeah, I mean, we've had various reactions, and I don't think I think we're sort of at the tipping point of showing this to Asian American audiences. This is the first Asian American film festival that we're playing in, so I'm interested in seeing the feedback. We're definitely handicapped in getting reactions from audiences, but we tried to do what we were doing, and I think that some people are getting what we tried to do, and I think that there'll be, everybody comes to a film with their own point of view, and I think that they will experience it in a different way. It's very interesting that you said this was an activist film, because most people had an issue with me because I wasn't making an advocacy film, and I specifically told them there'd be more than one point of view, and people are very used to seeing films that are one point of view, one side of the story with a nod to the other, and really have a very through line that's very advocacy related. So yeah, so it'll be interesting to see what people think, and we look forward to hearing more.
On that note, I want to thank you both for joining us today. And again, I'm sorry about my shadow image here. It's just this is one of the rare occasions when this is bright. So I want to thank everybody for joining today. Thank you, Ursula. Thank you, Michelle. And I just wanted to remind folks that this film is still viewable now, and if you haven't watched it, you should go watch it. The viewing window closes on Sunday night. If you enjoyed this conversation and the festival lineup, I encourage you to donate to VC Visual Communications. Your support will help sustain our year-round operations and programming. So you can go to vcmedia.org for more information. And again, I hope to see you all at another conversation. Our festival is going until October 31st. And go to, for updates on the festival, you can go to festival.vc.org, festival.vcmedia.org, or follow us on the social media accounts at VC Media, VC Film Festival. And don't forget to tag us on hashtag LAAPFF 2020. Thank you so much today for joining us from New York, my second home, and I hope to be visiting it very soon. It's really lovely to meet you, Michelle. It's so good to see you, Ursula. We need to go get our vegan burger next time I'm in town. And I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much, Lindy. Thanks.
Yeah, stick around for everybody. Stick around for the AWC folks that's coming up right now. Thank you both. Thank you so much.
Thank you.